the 68 BV installed.
Oh, yeah?
That was very nice.
We're starting yet, okay? So probably Jeanette will have to moderate a little bit and to see that everybody has its own time. Like, let's take 2 minutes of fame each to start, if you think, and let's go.
We'll probably start at this end.
Oh, God help me. I don't deserve 2 minutes of fame in this forum. But let's see.
And you can just say your name.
Right, so I'm Craig Partridge, and I guess the two things I'm most proud of that I actually pulled off were getting MX records right so that actually email worked, and what's more, we were able to collapse all the other networks into the internet because everyone was used to using domain names, and figuring out how to preserve us from ATM by figuring out how to build high-speed routers in the mid-90s. And my biggest sin was bringing ASN1 into network management. How's that?
That's right.
Okay.
Your single biggest contribution to the network management battle were to withdraw him in a diplomatic move and was much appreciated by the chairman at the time.
He did that. He told me 2 weeks before the meeting that I should consider withdrawing HAMS because he thought that would make things better.
It actually did.
I was at that meeting, that was a really...
I didn't
tell you when he...
That's true, you suggested, but when your boss's boss shows up in your door and says, I suggest, it has a real
So that
impact.
actually worked, so thank you for that. It was
Okay.
a big help to finally get to SNMP, as difficult as that was.
Okay, so that's me.
I'm Steve Bull, and I guess my biggest failure was I tried to privatize the NSFnet, and the academic community went off and did internet too, and so it didn't really happen. Hey, Steve.
Don't we get to talk about your biggest success too?
This isn't working. Each of us is not going to tell the right stories. We need to tell stories about each other.
Okay, so I'll start. The reason I am not wearing a jacket and tie is because 20 years ago, on the instruction of my BBN management, I went down to NSF wearing a jacket and tie, which I normally never wore at a technical meeting, and I walked into the office of my NSF sponsor, and he looked at me and he said, if you ever show up wearing a banker suit like that at NSF again, I will throw you out.
So Steve, how come you didn't throw me out?
Yours wasn't
I knew better.
Okay, works for me.
Trying to get you out of your suit's like trying to get a turtle out of its shell. Harder.
Well, Steve really needs to tell something else though, because some of the things that made all this work were decisions at NSF during your time frame, especially figuring out how to shut NSFnet down and still preserve the union and creating the network access point notion.
You're unplugged.
I think, was an
That's
enormous
a good idea. So was exchanging mail with MCI mail. I think we gave you a certificate or an official looking document. I think it had seals on it, and I've forgotten who signed it, but
Steve, I don't think that was actually the most important thing that you did. For those of you who don't know, Steve and I go way back to graduate school days. We actually have the same thesis advisor. But I think the thing that you did that was the most important single decision, in my opinion, was opening up the network so that it didn't have the tight control that it did when you took it over. DARPA had started the thing, and we ran it very tightly. It was open to defense contractors, DARPA researchers for the most part. Barry Liner was running it at the time. Barry Liner was working with you, and I remember Barry coming and saying on many occasions, I think, what they're doing is gonna, cause chaos out there. And you were pretty firm in saying, that's the American way. So you opened the whole thing up, and I think
it was,
you proved right in the final.
Bob, it was just a cover-up for recognizing our own incompetence at managing something like that.
Oh, that's what it was.
Having those two networks, though, did something really interesting, because it forced the need for EGP, a protocol for routers that weren't necessarily built by BB&N. And although EGP morphed after a while into BGP and other things, forcing us to have an interface between distinctly managed networks with different kinds of routers was actually an important innovation, I think.
Yeah, where's Dave Mills? He's the guy with the scars from that process.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a second thing that Steve did that I think was beneficial for everybody, and particularly for DARPA, for Vin, myself, and that was deciding to build on what we had done at DARPA. You could have gone a different path. And by
We could have
picking
done
that
that.
path, essentially made the internet happen the way it did. Now, whether you would have succeeded any other way is a different story, but I think we have.
I can remember Dave Farber and I having a long discussion over whether we should keep the IAB or not.
It wasn't the last time we held it.
Yes. But you know, it was the chutzpah of youth, so. Somebody tell some other stories, tell somebody else.
No,
Well, we're still going around.
These are really good ones. I mean, let me tell you one more thing that I think was really interesting in the history of this. When DARPA got out of the networking business, this was a decision that I think they had, maybe Craig Fields made it, I'm not sure. Back in
Yep.
1985.
It was
Yep.
Craig,
It was.
it was Craig, because he and I
1985.
bounced on that one.
And then right after that, Senator Gore got involved in his program to link up the supercomputer centers with fiber optics. DARPA jumped right back in the mix. When I left DARPA, there was nothing left there for, in the way of networking programs that were running. NSF decided to pick it up. And the first thing that you did was to try and figure out how to leverage the community. And I recall you asking if we would continue to run some of the standard stuff that we had started, including myself. And then I talked about that, and I don't know if you remember the way I do, or even the way Vint does, but we first said, no, this sounds like too administrative a job, go find somebody else. Remember that?
No, I don't.
And then Vint and I went and, figured that was it, and then about a month later, you came back and said, we can't find anybody who knows how to deal with these guys out there in the hills, and, it's the IAB, they won't deal with anybody else, would you please consider it again? And Vint and I went back again, put our heads together and again said, try harder, and then we came back a third time, and we finally said, okay, that works.
And a good thing it was, too.
Do you remember that?
Not in exactly that way, no.
What's your version?
No, I'm not gonna go into that. I'm not gonna do that one.
So that's the fun stuff.
So
We have to at some point, because,
begin
this is
at
history. If you don't write it
BB&M.
down or say it, it's lost.
But there is that saying, isn't it? Those things and deeds which are not written down are condemned to darkness and given over to the sepulcher of oblivion.
And that's where he wants it.
I mean, if you really want it there, okay, but, you might want to consider leaving it on the record.
No, I'll tell a Steve Lukasik story. At the time, Marshall Rose was working for you, and he was working on this because we really believed that ISO protocols were really going to happen, but nobody had any experience with them. And Marshall Rose was developing this marvelous shim that allowed you to run all those wonderful ISO protocols on top of IP. And it's called the ISO development environment, ISO DE. And he was working for you at the time.
Yes.
At Northrop Research. And we NSF, I thought that this was a good thing, but you didn't want him to do that because, you were paying him to do research for Northrop. So I said, okay, look, if we give you an ARPANET node, right, which, because Bob had, we had negotiated the ability to place ARPANET nodes at NSF discretion in certain places. If we give you an ARPANET node, would you accept that as payment, sort of payment in kind for Marshall continuing on ISO DE? You said, okay. And that was great.
best deal I had ever had.
He was right.
Well, yes, but at the time, ARPA was not doing ARPANET nodes.
Right.
DCA was doing them.
Right.
And the process had gotten bureaucratized. And as Bob mentioned, a little bit later on, Craig Fields was in the process of shutting down the ARPANET and decommissioning. And I believe, I'm not sure whether your IMP was decommissioned before or after it was delivered. But I do know that Northrop never really got on the ARPANET.
Yes, I think it happened after, I think that the two events were so close together that whatever it was, give or take 3 or 4 months, that's what happened. But I was very pleased to be able to push. of the network. I'm a great pusher of the network, and I was very pleased that we could sort of set Northrop up at the time, because this was sort of rare, you know, in those days. And in fact, there's an earlier story where I went to Bob when I was in the FCC. The FCC was trying to modernize itself.
It's still trying.
And I went to, and I went to Bob. We were going to, which has happened, fix it so all regulatory actions would all come in electronically and, you know, be posted electronically and comments posted electronically. But of course, I had a committee that had to map this out. So I went to Bob. I said, Bob, I need 4 mailboxes. This was, all I wanted was 4 mailboxes for the committee. And you graciously provided them. And as a result, we were able to put together, you know, the thinking and the plan. You always had to have a plan. And it subsequently grew, and now that's in fact the way regulatory agencies work. Is you deal with them this way, and the paper is only something that the lawyers, you know, like to have, and that's after the fact.
But the paper multiplies
Oh, yeah.
anyway, exponentially.
Yeah, well, that-
And the fact that it's virtual doesn't help a lot.
Actually, it's worse, because the fact that I can send you more bits electronically
It's very easy.
means that somebody has to print it eventually, and the point is that I'm producing more bits faster.
That's right, there's no disincentive to keep producing more and more and more.
That's right, because you don't see the paper, because you're doing it electronically, and
But
it's
for
just
some
some poor
organizations, that's
person.
their only output.
Well, for one of the things that I did after I left ARPA was I went to Xerox. And I was always interested to know where all of our principal investigators were vanishing to. It's because Xerox PARC was hiring all the ARPA principal investigators. So I figured, well, in order to find out what they're doing, since everything was closed and proprietary and so on, so I went to Xerox, mainly basically on an intelligence collection mission to find out what was going on. In fact, good things were going on, the Ethernet and the, the Dynabook and so on, we don't know PC. And, but the amusing thing is, here's this great strategic vision of Peter McCullough on the paperless office. But in fact, what was Xerox's contribution to the paperless office? It was the office network system that would have an online, what we call a printer, on the net, and it was going to generate paper.
Right.
And one of the great strategic moves that Xerox made that was foolish was, again following the sort of Harvard Business School approach to things, was to decide that they should get out of the consumables business, which was toner cartridges and paper. And so they divested themselves of that, and they never really made a go of things.
Sell razors and not the blades.
Hmm?
Sell razors and not the blades.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. And they totally missed that. They could have been a great paper company and a great toner cartridge company until of course, CCD arrays and the like, would have eventually driven them out of the photoreceptor business. But in any event, it was very interesting to see the ARPA stuff, because Xerox, which great people at PARC, just to see that, and then what the rest of the company did. I didn't stick around. I left after 2 years.
I'd like to make a comment about this. One of the tragedies in my mind is that Xerox PARC, with all its enormous technical talent, and a company whose management really wanted to succeed and have major product impact, failed.
Yep.
In the big picture.
Yep.
I mean, look what the people around here actually got done. I mean, they all changed the world, let's face it. And it was not a lot more people than are here, maybe a factor of 10, who knows, who cares. But that effort should have come to such minor results for the company.
Well,
It's interesting, and I think there's a lesson about technology may be necessary for success, sure as hell isn't sufficient.
Yeah, yeah.
There was something missing.
You see, what they did was they invented the local area net, the
Oh, yeah,
internet,
which was huge.
which they could never figure out what to do with
Right.
because it wasn't integrated into a system and a business plan, because we could never make the case. So they gave it away. And of course, it's all those lands that get linked together into the internet. I mean, because, so that it was the technology that made local area networking possible in a way that wide area network was never going to sell enough customers, to. And so there was just this whole series of accidents. And I really would like to point out something that has perhaps been missed, that we all sort of don't realize, is that we all are happy with ARPA and the ARPANET and the things that were done and the technology and all the things that happened thereafter. It was basically a violation of DoD regulations. And the OSD auditors called us on it around 1973. And they said,
I was gone.
do you know what you people did? And we said, well, what did we do? They said, you developed an operational communications network. And because 75% of the traffic on the ARPANET was, in fact, email. And they said, DCA is supposed to do that. And so when you said it all became bureaucratized, yes, that's right, and that's because we were, in principle, never supposed to have done it in the first place.
That's right, and we didn't on principle.
Oh, and this genius management didn't know they were breaking the regulations, and so as long as so then I said, that's a fine idea, because at that point there was this big fight about what Auto Din 2 was supposed to be. And so I mean, I thought it was this wonderful opportunity, because if you made, and it wasn't us making DCA take over the ARPANET, it was the whole DCA, I mean, the whole OSD, DoD structure said, you guys have to run it. As a result, they got packets in their blood, and that turned out to be quite an accidental technology transfer mode. And it's this whole series of accidents.
I always had a question about that, because I always thought that was one of the cool things about working on the ARPANET project, which is it was a theoretically Department of Defense project, and I guess once in a blue moon I would actually be in a secure classified meeting about it, but by and large it was about as non-military as I could imagine.
Right.
And I got the impression, and I don't know for sure because I was not a politics guy, that Steve or somebody had to go to Congress every year
Yeah.
and make a case
Yeah.
that this
Yeah,
project
yeah.
had something to do with defense.
You mean
Yeah.
this Steve?
Yep.
This Steve?
I started-
That's right.
Yeah, I started that sequence.
And what
I
I can't
testified-
imagine what you, considering what we were doing,
Well, let me tell
I
you.
can't imagine what you would say.
I'll tell you, it's not very hard.
It's trivially easy.
It's very obvious what was going on. We had a small effort that was officially to improve technology for command and control systems. Period, and that was it. That was the
It was sort
ostensible
of just a
purpose.
demonstration kind of thing.
No, hear me out. We were realistic enough to know that it was hard. In fact, it's nearly impossible for most of you, even though you were all players, to imagine. Suddenly for the younger investigators, nobody was sure it could be done at all. I mean that. I mean, I was reasonably savvy technically, but I wasn't sure. These guys had to do their thing, and they turned out to be not all that hard. But it was a long shot. It was a real long shot. And I always, when I'm in a situation like that, like to make a real contribution to science, to the basics, on the way. The price of that is trivially small, 10% of the total, max. And boy, does it pay back when you hit it out of the park. And boy, did it.
I don't deny that.
It was not very complicated. Let
Okay.
me tell you, that story flew with Congress every time. My problems were not with Congress, my problems were in the building. Oh, you know, no names here.
I'd like to actually comment on Steve's comment about the accidental transfer to DCA.
Yeah.
Because I actually think it wasn't accidental, but the reasons why it transferred were accidental.
Yeah.
And so here's my take on that history. DCA, at the time we were doing ARPANET, was totally committed to circuit switching. In fact, they had a notion of an audited two system that was going to be a fast circuit switching system, and set out to plan that. The folks in the Pentagon who were overseeing, and I don't remember whether it was yet CQDI, it might have been something called DTAX at the time, formerly been ASDT, and they basically were more aware of what DARPA had done. I think Steve Walker might have transferred over there by then, who had some familiarity with it, who was a DARPA program manager. And you know, maybe it was before he got there and they just knew. But in any event, they asked Erwin Lebo, who was then from Lincoln Labs, to do a study for them.
Yes.
And Erwin produced the study and said, instead of doing what you're planning to do, which is build a whole fast circuit switching network, why don't you use the DARPA technology and build what he called a thin line network. He wrote a report on that in 1974, sent it to, let me call it CQDI in the Pentagon. DCA would have no part of it, want it. They hated the ARPANET. They thought this was a work of the devil and really should go away. Next thing that happens is that Erwin gets the job as chief scientist at DCA. So Harry Van Trees was there at the time. At the time, Harry and George Hallmeyer were vying for the DARPA job. And you know, George got it because he was backed by Mal Curry, I think. And Harry had the backing of Don Rumsfeld, who was in the secretary. It turned out the DDR&E got the last word, I guess. So George got the job, Harry left, and in comes Erwin Lebo to take it over. Well, during that whole period, while Harry was there, he had a deputy named Estill Hoverston, who was a good friend of mine. Estill and I used to play tennis a few times a week, and we had been on the MIT faculty together, and we were constantly arguing about transitions. And we managed to convince, I managed to convince Estill to convince Harry to take on the DCA establishment to get them to take it over. Well, the reason they wanted to take it over was to kill it. They did not want to take it over to have anything good to do with it. They wanted to kill it. So meanwhile, Erwin then comes in, takes the chief scientist job, and he's the one that wrote the report, and he's suddenly finding that the establishment is again him. He's inherited this establishment problem. So they get ordered by CQDI, take another look. They take another look and they decide, maybe packet switching really has some merits, but clearly it can't be the way DARPA did it because of a bunch of researchers. It's got to be done based on military needs, military requirements by people who really know how to build a system. So they put out a bid at that point for something called Autoden 2. Autoden 2 was now going to be a packet net. It was to have 8 nodes around the country. Each node was going to have 3 shifts of, I don't know, maybe 8 people. So very expensive to run, very hub-like, like the airlines.
Didn't that still include logging each message at each node?
At that point, they didn't have these details yet worked out.
Okay.
Maybe it came later. So they actually put a bid out, and the bid went, I think, to Western Union, and Western Union won it, and had a panel there. I got asked by Lee Pascal, who at that time was the director of the DCA, if I would chair an advisory, a blue ribbon panel to review the recommendations. And I remember thinking, you know, what they're doing here is going to lead to a system that's more costly, less efficient, and really not, I mean, it may have been a military solution, but it wasn't a good one. And I said to him, you know, here's what I really think. Do you want this in the final report or not? He said, look, he says, you caused me so much trouble here with my guys. I don't want, he knew, he understood perfectly.
Yeah.
He said, I don't want to hear it. Just tell me about what's in the proposals. I want to know if they reviewed them properly, what are the issues we're going to have if we fund either of them. So we did. We wrote them a report. I signed off on it. They funded them. They built the thing. And One day after it was delivered and accepted by DCA, they canceled the whole thing, and they went back to the DARPA technology, which became the essence of the DDM.
One day.
One day later.
I think Katie and Peter have something to say.
You skipped some stuff.
I skipped all the security stuff, which was really important, but that's the
You
way.
skipped a lot more.
When did the acceptance and then definition happen?
That's what I was told, I mean.
No, but what date?
Would have been roughly 1980 sometime.
1980?
Well,
Yeah.
Peter-
well, actually, Bob,
June was the cancellation date.
no, I'm trying to remember now. The Western Union got that contract to build the ARPANET, the Audited 2, in 1976.
That's what I was
That's
told.
right, because they started using the first 1974 TCP design that you and I and Yogan did.
Right, and in fact, I wanted to work on that project so bad, and I wound up, as soon as it was announced that Western Union got the job, even though I really didn't know anything about Western Union as a company, I called them up and I said, I've been doing research in packet switching and I'd like to work on this project. And they hired me, and I was the systems engineer on the thing. So that whole thing about, the 8 nodes and the hub and spoke design and all, I worked on. And
Sorry.
No. But I showed up after the proposal, and after your blue ribbon panel, and I tried to. In fact, I was introduced to the ARPANET people like John McQuillan and Vince Cerf and the like, and I went to ARPANET meetings, and I started realizing how wrong that design was. And it turns out that the project went through a huge re-architecture. And we developed a new way of building the network. And got sign off inside because there were multiple subcontractors. Western Union being a typical carrier, the way they did it is that they actually had other people supply the technology. The 2 others were CSC and Ford Aerospace. And those guys were under contract to build this stuff. And several years into it, so this is now about 2 years later, I realized that we ran into what I would call a real classic DoD, just get the money and don't deliver anything mode. So I left and sort of resigned under protest
This was from Western Union?
from Western Union in '78 and wound up at BBN. And then a couple years later, the Audited 2 project was actually going through final systems test acceptance, and the Air Force was appointed as the agency to do the final acceptance testing of it, and they needed somebody to show up at Scott Air Force Base to witness the test.
That was you.
And they found me at BBN. So they gave a little contract to BBN. I think I was working for Alex at the time. And I get this assignment to go there, and I review the test plan, and I remember the spec because I worked, it was my revised design, right? And I'm looking at this test plan, and I said, you're not testing 3/4 of this stuff. Right? Oh, well, we threw away the 3/4. We're never going to implement that 3/4. and oh, really? And so, well, what's left here, let's watch what you're going to do here. And it failed miserably. I mean,
Help me out on the timing, because that's the thing I just know anecdotally. They did accept it, I believe.
oh, yes, so we're coming to that.
How long?
But it didn't work.
But how long did they accept it before they canceled it?
Oh, no. By then, the word had already happened, and we had meetings. In fact, you and I met to talk about this, and I talked to Steve Walker and a couple of others, and Vint, and that whole replica project was already kind of in the wings. And when General Hilsman, was that?
Oh, yeah, Bill Hillsman.
When General Hilsman, so it was a faulty network, and I was really, I wasn't trying to build the internet. I was just trying to kill this alternative thing, which I thought was really going to be a disaster for the DoD. I mean, if there's one thing that I always thought that the military ought to really know is how to communicate, so they avoid shooting the wrong guys at the wrong time. Okay, period. As simple as that. It's sort of a safety thing. They ought to know how to communicate well. And
they, so Hillsman accepted the network. There was only one subscriber, the SAC, Strategic Air Command. He was the only ones who had built that SIP interface to actually connect to this thing. Okay, and he said, okay, I'm accepting it, and there shall be no other subscribers connected to it. And then came the DDN shootout, and at the end of the DDN shootout is when he terminated the network.
That's fast. Now, how did the
Okay.
shootout?
Can I make just 2 points to make sure there's a little bit of history? One is, the ARPANET operation was transferred to DCA before all this Audit and 2 stuff.
1970
Craig Fields did that.
75.
He called me in and said,
75.
cooperate with DCA, so that had happened. That wasn't, it's not that DCA didn't have that already. The other thing is, I just want to mention, is BB&N lost the original procurement to Western Union, bidding the ARPANET technology.
Yeah.
But DCA really, in its engineering center and in its headquarters, did not know what a packet was. They were just administrating that network and paying the bills
Yeah, exactly.
and hoping one day it would go away.
Oh, they
That's all
were ready to
Well,
retire it.
the terms under which they accepted it from ARPA stipulated that it would go away as soon as an alternative system was available, as an alternative official DoD system was available.
And that would have been AutoDIN 2?
It stipulated that the ARPANET would go away, and they intended, as I understand it, to replace it with AutoDIN 2, which would be the official system. And let me make one other comment
But
about...
Alex, what they actually also did was agreed that the policy of the future of the ARPANET would remain with DARPA.
Yeah.
But they had the
Yes,
operation.
right.
So-
They were just the operators, yes.
So DARPA could have changed the policy.
And that's how Steve could make a deal with DARPA to put an ARPANET node run by DCA at, where were you? At Northrop. Yes, because DARPA was still making the policy. But let me make a comment about the original competition. BBN did compete on the AutoDIN 2 bid, and I was not a part of that competition. But I know that an enormous amount of paper was produced by BBN, certainly probably by an order of magnitude the biggest proposal BBN had produced up to that time. And I have been told that DCA gave long lists of numbered paragraphs with subparagraphs and subparagraphs and sub-subparagraphs. And BBN, in its technical arrogance, said, well, if you write answers to all these paragraphs, that's not what's going to tell them how this really works. We should write a narrative description of what we're going to do. And so they did that. And then DCA took the proposal and tore it up into pieces and gave paragraph 1 to this set of people to review and paragraph 2 to this other set of people to do. And they couldn't do that with BBN's proposal, and so all the reviewers said, this isn't compliant, and it was no doubt that we lost.
As a BBNer, subsequently, I want to say that the pain of that experience lingered and lingers to this day. The notion that BBN absolutely should not try to decide what the customer thought the format of the proposal should be. That process beat it into us. It's still there. There is still an institutional memory that says they might hand it out to separate reviewers by paragraph, so you absolutely must follow the proposal format.
And John McQuillan begged the BB&N management to do it the way the request for proposal asked for it, and the BB&N management, in its wisdom, said, no, this is not the right way. And we thought we were going to win, because at the party, after we submitted the proposal at Joyce Chen's Chinese restaurant, the fortune cookie said, you will have bushels of gold.
You did, because the DDN is what emerged and BB&N ended up with Central.
By the way,
Building.
I've always viewed that Keith Unkefer had a pretty big input into telling, DCA and Carlucci and people that they had to cancel the Western Union contract.
I think more than anybody else, the Navy did, because they said we were supposed to stop funding them.
Yeah.
when you talk about DCA, I mean, we're all pretending DCA is a government agency. And in fact, it was really a front for AT&T. So that all these things we're saying about, DCA like this and didn't like that and so on, I mean, DCA was really people who ordered lines from AT&T, and that was their technical, substance. And
That's because it was a monopoly.
Well, partly it was a monopoly, but I think in fact it was more of
That's
an
the only company
arrogance.
to order them
It was an
from.
arrogance that said, we do technical, we do circuit switching. Circuit switching is very good. At that time, in the 1940s and 1950s, circuit switching was kind of okay.
Yes.
And of course, why do you want to shoot your business plan in the head? So of course they were selling circuit switching.
That's the only thing telephone people understood.
Well, they
I'm sorry,
understood
can I ask a
it, and
question
they were
about-
very good at it, I mean, Bell Labs was a first-rate institution, just like Park was and so, you could sort of put this, if you wanted to put it in a sort of great ideological battle
And
with
one
the God.
succeeded, the other did not.
Yeah, well, it was essentially, it was an AT&T versus Park, if you want to put it in terms of industrial laboratories.
Steve, question
But it
about-
was that the digits worked out, they were really good.
DCA did more than just circuit switching, though. First of all, they were running Auto 1, and they were running Auto DIN, which is a message switching system. And second, or third,
Message
I guess,
switching is true, that's right.
they also were providing dedicated point-to-point circuits, which is how we got the ARPANET AT&T links initially, if I understood
They
correctly.
procured them.
Well, it's why, in
Procured them.
fact, we got it
Sir?
to work,
procured them.
because
They
it
were
was
procured,
leased
yeah.
lines, it was private leased lines, so it wasn't an operational
That's right.
system, but it became operational.
So
They
let
finally
me tell you what I
sprung it on
what
us.
I saw at the Blue Ribbon panel. We weren't involved in doing the review of the proposals. But when it came to us, we never saw the BBN proposal, as I recall. It never propagated to that level. So I don't know how many showed up originally.
Well, there were only two bidders, I think.
No, there
Oh,
were
there
more.
were like a dozen.
There were more. My recollection is the ones that actually survived, AT&T was one, Western Union was one, it was another. I think IT&T may have been in the mix, and I think the fourth one might have been some Caribbean tropical communications or something like
I'm
that.
sorry, wait a minute, for which?
This is the Audited two bid.
Oh, audited too, okay.
That's my recollection. And, very, very quickly, it got down to just a couple of issues, one of which was
Well, maybe it was the
AT&T.
Cayman Islands.